Ever get that feeling, where a story seems a little too good to be true, like almost too wild to believe?
It's that feeling you get when someone maybe seemingly defies the odds, effortlessly achieving the impossible, almost like they're winking at you while they do it.
And no one, I think, embodies that more than our subject for this deep dive, Frank Abagnale.
The infamous con man.
The con man who had the whole world fooled.
Hmm. Or at least that's how the book and movie Catch Me If You Can wants to tell it.
Millions in bad checks, impersonating airline pilots,
Yeah.
even a doctor, all before he could legally order a drink.
And that's the allure right there, isn't it? It's that audacity that gets us.
Yeah.
It plays right into our desires for the extraordinary. It's thrilling to watch someone outsmart the system, even if it's just vicariously.
But I think what's really interesting, maybe even more so, is how this story, a story full of inconsistencies and fabrications, how it was able to captivate us for so long. What does that say about us as a society? Are we all just suckers for a good yarn? Or is there something more at play here?
And that's exactly the question we're going to try and unpack today. We'll separate the fact from the fiction. We'll examine not only what Abagnale did, but why his story struck a chord with people around the world.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. What was it about the 1960s that allowed someone like Abagnale to succeed?
Imagine a time before these really sophisticated security systems, before background checks. It was a time when, well, a charming smile and a confident attitude could open almost any door. Doors that today you'd need a fingerprint scan or a retinal scan to get through.
So a perfect storm then. A mix of cunning and a more trusting time.
Yes, exactly. Whether by sheer luck or, by design, Abagnale took advantage of a system that was struggling to keep up with these new kinds of con artists.
Let's talk about the pilot impersonation. It's become iconic, hasn't it? But how did he manage to convince an entire airline he was a pilot? Did no one check ID back then?
That's where the details get even more fascinating. While Abagnale says he flew around the globe for free, the reality is a little less impressive, according to reports. The evidence that supports his claims of this extensive pilot scheme is scant at best.
Wait, hold on. So he didn't actually fly any planes. What about the Pan Am uniform? Someone must have noticed that, right?
Yes, the uniform. Abagnale was very proud, seemingly, of his Pan Am piloting days. He even claimed that he got the uniform by, well, simply calling the airline. And believe it or not, back then, airlines often just mailed out replacements for lost uniforms. There wasn't a lot of verification.
Seriously, they just mailed them out? Anyone
Yeah.
could call it. That seems unbelievably easy.
Remember, it was a different time. Trust was given more freely, especially in those professional settings. Combine that with Abagnale's self-admitted talent for deception, that natural charisma, and suddenly the impossible seems just a little more believable, doesn't it?
So while the scale of the flying might be exaggerated, there's probably some truth to him, well, playing the system.
Exactly, and that reveals something very interesting about the story itself. Abagnale was weaving together just enough truth with his fabrications to make it all seem believable. It blurred the lines between reality and make-believe.
Okay, so we've got a less secure time, a charming con man, but what about the money? Abagnale bragged about cashing millions in fake checks. Was that another exaggeration, or was he really pulling off heists like that?
That's where investigative reports are incredibly helpful. See, while Abagnale claimed to have forged checks worth millions, the real documented amount linked back to him is significantly less, maybe even a little embarrassing for a supposed criminal mastermind.
So not exactly the mastermind he made himself out to be then.
Perhaps not on that scale, no. But the difference between what he claimed and the evidence, it begs the question, why inflate the numbers? Was it simply to make the story more exciting, more appealing? To publishers, to Hollywood?
You know what they say? Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And Abagnale's story, even with all its embellishments, was undoubtedly a good story. But let's move on to one of Abagnale's more, unsettling claims. That's the one about practicing medicine, even posing as a pediatrician.
Yeah, this is where that, charming rogue narrative starts to fall apart a little.
Right.
Abagnale claimed to have actually worked as a doctor for, get this, almost a year.
Really?
Even going so far as to say that he supervised interns.
No.
Oh, yeah, and performed actual medical procedures.
Okay, now that actually gives me chills. You're saying this guy with zero medical training was let loose on a hospital full of patients. That seems unbelievably irresponsible, even for the 60s.
It's a wild claim, right? And yeah, this one especially has been picked apart over the years.
I bet.
And investigators, well, They haven't found any evidence at all to back up Abinyale's story. No medical school records, no employment records, no licenses.
So another fabrication then. But why go to such lengths to make up something so outrageous? It seems risky, even for a con man.
Maybe it was that risk, that pushing the boundaries, that made it so captivating. But there's something else to think about here. This claim, if it's not true, it carries a different kind of weight than, say, pretending to be a pilot.
Because it plays on people's fears
Yeah.
about, like, health,
Yeah.
being vulnerable.
Exactly. The idea that someone could take advantage of that trust, could mess with people's well-being like that, it's unsettling. And it's not just about Abinyale's ethics. It makes you question the systems that allowed that kind of claim to be even remotely believable.
It makes you wonder, was the media even involved? Like, maybe they were interested in sensational headlines, and Avignale was giving them exactly what they wanted, a story too good to check.
It's possible. The media's role in all of this is definitely something to think about. Did they exaggerate things? Did they overlook inconsistencies because they wanted to present a captivating story? It's hard to know for sure. But one thing's for sure, the media landscape was a very different place back in the 60s.
Less scrutiny, more about the story itself and less about the facts.
Exactly. And in that world, a charismatic figure like Abinyale, well, he could easily manipulate things. He could create a version of himself that was, let's say, more fiction than fact.
Okay, so we've got a charming con man, a time when things were a bit more lax, a media happy to play along. But what about Abignale himself? What allowed him to pull all this off, even if it wasn't as grand as he claimed?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems like he had this unique mix of confidence, charm, and, maybe a little psychological insight. He knew how to work systems. He knew where to look for weaknesses.
So more than just a con man, like a social engineer, he knew how to manipulate people, sure, but also entire systems.
Absolutely. And I think that's a big part of why his story still resonates. It wasn't just about the checks or the uniform. It was about exposing the cracks in our society's foundation of trust.
Okay, that's a bit chilling when you put it like that. Did he ever, like, express any remorse for what he did? Did he ever say, like, hey, I messed up, or acknowledge that he might have actually hurt people?
Here's where things get even more interesting. Abinyale's later years are full of contradictions. On one hand, he's profited hugely from his past, security consultant, giving talks about fraud prevention.
Talk about irony. The con man becomes the con catcher.
Right. It's wild. But at the same time, he's also said he regrets his actions. He said he was just a misguided kid caught up in it all.
Do you believe him? Was it real remorse or just another part of his, like, carefully crafted image?
That's the question, isn't it? Can a master manipulator ever really change? Or is their whole being based on lies, even when they're looking inward?
Okay, I get it now. I can see why this story, even with all its issues, is so compelling. It's about identity, about trust, that line between truth and lies. It's like we're drawn in by the mystery of it all.
It's true. And that's what makes a good story, isn't it? Keeps us hooked, even when we suspect we're being played a bit.
So where does that leave us? We can't take Abignale's word for everything. The media might have, added their own spin. How do we make sense of the fact that Catch Me If You Can is still so popular?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. The book and the movie, they're based on his life, sure, but they take liberties. They turn this complex, morally ambiguous guy into someone almost charming, an anti-hero you can read for.
The Hollywood treatment, right?
Exactly. They give us this quick-witted, resourceful guy who's always a step ahead. And we find ourselves rooting for him, even though we know he's doing wrong.
Maybe deep down we admire that a little. It's like sticking it to the man.
I think you're onto something. We live in a world with these huge systems, and they don't always feel fair, do they? Abignale's story, even if it's exaggerated, lets us enjoy the fantasy of outsmarting those systems.
And let's not forget who directed the movie, Spielberg. Catch Me If You Can wasn't just a film. It was an event.
You're right. Spielberg's direction, DiCaprio, Tom Hanks, they made Abignale's story a part of our culture. It's more about the myth, the legend now, than the actual guy.
So we're left with this mix of truth, lies, and Hollywood magic.
Yeah.
What are our listeners supposed to take from all of this? How do we deal with a world where the story's often more appealing than the truth?
I think the key is healthy skepticism. Question everything, especially those stories that just seem a little too perfect. Look for proof, get different perspectives, and don't be afraid to question things, even if everyone else thinks they're true.
Easier said than done, though, right? Especially these days with social media and, misinformation everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. We have to be careful about what we believe. Think critically. Don't just take things at face value. Do your own digging, ask the hard questions, and be open to changing your mind if new evidence pops up.
So maybe Frank Abagiala's story, as messy as it is, can teach us something, like a cautionary tale.
I'd say so. He reminds us that things aren't always what they seem, that charm can be a weapon, and that sometimes the most captivating stories are hiding something more complicated underneath.
It's a good reminder that we should all be a bit more discerning. Not so quick to believe everything we hear.
Hmm.
Because like we've seen today, the real con isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about our perceptions, our beliefs, falling for a good story even when something feels off.
Well said. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places.
And on that note, we'll leave you to think about Frank Abagnale and his many faces. Was he a master manipulator or just a product of his time? Maybe a little both. That's up to you to decide.